Something significant is unfolding in Western Canada right now, and it's starting to draw attention well beyond Ottawa. I'm Emily Carter, a U.S. political and global affairs analyst, breaking down how power moves beyond the headlines. In Alberta and Saskatchewan, independence movements that were once considered fringe are now moving into formal political territory. This is no longer just talk radio or online debate. Official processes are underway. On January 2nd, Elections Alberta approved a citizen-led initiative allowing the Alberta Prosperity Project to begin collecting signatures for a potential separation referendum. Under provincial rules, organizers must gather roughly 178,000 signatures by May 2nd, about 10% of voters from the last provincial election. That approval matters because it signals that the issue has crossed a legal and procedural threshold. According to organizers, signature events have already taken place in cities like Edmonton, Calgary, and Red Deer, as well as in rural communities. Supporters describe the gatherings as broad and cross-sectional, while critics caution that early enthusiasm doesn't always translate into referendum outcomes. Still, the fact that the process is moving forward is what's driving attention. Saskatchewan is watching closely. There, the Saskatchewan Prosperity Project is pursuing a separate, non-binding referendum initiative with a signature target of around 125,000. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe has indicated he does not intend to block the process, framing it as a matter of allowing public expression rather than endorsing separation itself. Taken together, these developments represent a notable shift. For years, frustration in Western Canada has centered on federal policy disputes, particularly around energy development, environmental regulation, and fiscal transfers administered from Ottawa. Alberta and Saskatchewan are among Canada's most resource-rich provinces, and both have long argued that national policies disproportionately limit their economic autonomy. Supporters of the independence movements point to federal pipeline decisions, environmental regulations, and Canada's equalization payment system as sources of ongoing tension. Critics respond that national coordination is essential for economic stability and that separation would introduce major legal and economic uncertainty. What's important here is not which side is right. It's that the conversation itself has changed. Provincial leaders, federal officials, and even international observers are now responding to something that has moved from political frustration into procedural reality. That shift alone alters the balance of leverage between Western provinces and Ottawa. And this is where the story begins to widen. Because once formal referendum mechanisms are activated, the issue is no longer just about protest or symbolism. It becomes about timelines, legal obligations, negotiations, and external relationships, including how the United States views energy security, trade, and regional stability in North America. That's where the implications extend well beyond Canada's internal politics. And it's also where the stakes become much clearer. To understand why independence movements in Alberta and Saskatchewan have reached this stage, you have to look at the long-running relationship between Western Canada and Ottawa. For years, leaders in Alberta and Saskatchewan have argued that federal policy decisions are made primarily with central Canada in mind, particularly Ontario and Quebec, while the economic realities of energy-producing provinces are treated as secondary. Much of the tension centers on energy policy. Alberta holds the third-largest proven oil reserves in the world, along with major natural gas and critical mineral resources. Saskatchewan plays a key role in agriculture, potash, and energy production. Supporters of greater provincial autonomy argue that federal environmental regulations, pipeline restrictions, and permitting delays have limited their ability to fully develop those resources. Federal officials counter that national climate commitments and environmental standards apply equally across the country, and that coordinated policy is necessary to balance economic growth with environmental responsibility. Another flashpoint is Canada's equalization payment system. Under this system, the federal government redistributes tax revenue from wealthier provinces to support public services in provinces with lower fiscal capacity. Alberta and Saskatchewan have long been net contributors. Quebec and several Atlantic provinces have been major recipients. Supporters of the system describe it as a cornerstone of national unity. Critics in Western Canada argue it has created a permanent imbalance, where resource-producing provinces contribute heavily, but have limited influence over national policy outcomes. Legal disputes have added to the frustration. Alberta has challenged federal authority in court over energy and environmental regulations, winning several high-profile cases. Provincial leaders have argued that even after those rulings, Ottawa continues to pursue policies that achieve similar outcomes through different mechanisms. From the federal perspective, officials maintain that policy evolution is normal and that court decisions do not prevent future legislation within constitutional boundaries. What's changed recently is not just policy disagreement, it's political patience. Provincial governments have spent years negotiating, litigating, and lobbying for adjustments within the federal system. Independence advocates argue that those efforts have produced limited results, leading to a shift from reform-focused pressure to structural questions about the relationship itself. That shift doesn't mean separation is inevitable, but it does explain why movements that once struggled to gain traction are now being taken seriously by provincial authorities, national media, and international observers. At this stage, independence functions less as a final destination and more as leverage. It forces conversations that were previously easy to delay. It introduces timelines, and it changes how Ottawa, provincial governments, and external partners assess risk. Which brings us to the part of this story that has drawn attention outside Canada. Because once formal separation mechanisms are activated, the question is no longer just domestic, it becomes geopolitical. Once formal referendum processes are triggered, these movements stop being just a Canadian domestic issue. They start to attract outside attention, especially from the United States. That's already happening. According to public reporting and statements from organizers, representatives associated with the Alberta Prosperity Project have held meetings with U.S. officials, including discussions involving the State Department. American officials have described these contacts as routine meetings with civil society groups, emphasizing that no formal commitments have been made. Still, the fact that these conversations are taking place at all is notable. From a U.S. perspective, the interest is largely strategic rather than ideological. Alberta is one of the most energy-rich regions in the world. It holds massive oil and natural gas reserves and sits directly north of the United States. American policymakers have long viewed Canadian energy as a stable alternative to reliance on more volatile global suppliers. Supporters of greater Alberta autonomy argue that an independent or more self-directed province would move more aggressively to expand energy infrastructure, including pipelines and export capacity. Critics respond that independence would introduce years of legal uncertainty, trade renegotiations, and regulatory complexity that could offset those advantages. U.S. officials have been careful in their public language. Statements from Washington have focused on respecting Canadian sovereignty while acknowledging Alberta's economic importance and its role as a long-term energy partner. That balance reflects a broader reality. The United States has strong incentives to monitor developments without appearing to influence internal Canadian decisions. Meanwhile, reactions within Canada have been sharply divided. Some provincial leaders, including officials in British Columbia, have condemned discussions with U.S. representatives as inappropriate. Others argue that exploring economic and diplomatic options is a normal part of political planning, especially when constitutional pathways explicitly allow for negotiation following a democratic mandate. What's clear is that the conversation has moved into a new phase. Independence is no longer framed solely as protest. It is being discussed in terms of feasibility, negotiation, and international consequences, even by those who ultimately oppose it. And that brings us to a key question for anyone watching this unfold. Do you see these independence efforts primarily as leverage to force changes from Ottawa, or as the early stages of a genuine push towards sovereignty? Share your perspective in the comments, because how this is interpreted will shape what comes next, both inside Canada and across North America. At this point, it's important to separate political momentum from legal reality. Even if a separation referendum were to pass in Alberta or Saskatchewan, independence would not happen overnight. Canada's constitution does not allow unilateral secession, but it also does not allow the federal government to simply ignore a clear democratic mandate. After Quebec's 1995 referendum, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that if a clear majority votes for independence on a clear question, the rest of Canada has a constitutional obligation to negotiate, not to approve automatically, but to engage. That negotiation phase would be complex and lengthy. It would involve dividing federal assets and liabilities, addressing citizenship and currency questions, renegotiating trade arrangements, and determining control over infrastructure, military installations, and regulatory systems. Legal experts estimate the process would likely take years, not months. Supporters of independence argue that this complexity is manageable and that long-term autonomy is worth the transitional uncertainty. Critics counter that the economic and legal risks are too high, especially for provinces whose economies are deeply integrated with the rest of Canada. Public opinion reflects that uncertainty. Polling in Alberta and Saskatchewan shows significant minority support for independence, but not yet a clear majority. Analysts note that support often rises when voters express frustration with Ottawa and falls when questions turn to practical consequences. That gap between emotional momentum and policy detail is where future campaigns would be decided. There is also a broader political impact, regardless of outcome. Even a failed referendum would strengthen provincial leverage. It would force federal leaders to address long-standing grievances more directly. It would alter negotiations around energy policy, fiscal transfers, and regulatory authority. And it would signal that Western Canada's concerns can no longer be dismissed as temporary discontent. For the United States, the situation will remain one to watch, not direct. Energy security, trade stability, and regional cooperation all depend on predictable outcomes. American officials have strong incentives to remain neutral publicly while preparing privately for multiple scenarios. Ultimately, this decision belongs to the people of Alberta and Saskatchewan. Whether independence becomes a destination or remains a bargaining tool, something fundamental has already changed. Questions that once seemed unthinkable are now being debated openly, through formal processes with real timelines. And once that door opens, it does not fully close again. If you want more analysis that explains how political power shifts, how institutions respond, and how decisions in one country can ripple across an entire region, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because these kinds of stories don't end on election night. They unfold over time, and understanding them early matters.